let's go ahead. Let's talk about our first lesson for the harvest field. If you want to write it down, here it goes. We've got to be willing to touch the unclean. We've got to be willing to touch the unclean. It's Matthew chapter 8. Let's read it together. It's verses 1 through 4. It says, when he came down from the mountain, there's our Mount Sinai terminology again, right? Jesus has been up like Moses on a mountainside. He's teaching. He's making declarations about the will of God. Now he comes down from the mountain, and look what happens. He comes down from the mountain. Great crowds followed him. And behold, a leper came to him. You might want to highlight. The leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will. Would you highlight that phrase? If you will. Or maybe your text reads, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Would you highlight that word? Or what other similar word is there in your translation? You can make me clean. Let's look what happens. Verse number 3, it says, and he, talking about Jesus, stretched out his hand and touched him. Now everybody gasp. Yeah, this is what everyone in the crowd was doing that day, to include Jesus' disciples. How many of you already know that you don't touch a leper in ancient society? So everybody gasps, I'm sure. He says, I will, or maybe your translation reads, I am willing, be clean. And immediately, everybody say immediately with me. Immediately, his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone. Well, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? But he goes on to say this, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof or a witness or a testimony, maybe your translation reads, to the people, or maybe your translation reads, to them, talking about the priests. So again, here's our first miracle of the 10 in these pages that we know today as Matthew 8, 9, and 10. We've got to be willing to do what Jesus did, and we've got to be willing to reach out and touch the unclean. Now, we don't have a specific location, again, for where this miracle took place. All we know is Jesus comes down from the mountain, and there's a great crowd there, and there's a man there who is willing to, even though he's full of leprosy, even though he's not supposed to, maybe he doesn't know any better, but most likely he's very aware of it. He comes and he falls at the feet of Jesus and says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Now, you should have a footnote if you've got a study Bible, or you should have some of those parentheses there by this account to let you know that, guess what? This story is shared by all three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is what we refer to as triple tradition. Everybody say triple tradition. We've talked about this term before. Now, this is a story that was so important for every gospel writer that it shows up in their gospel accounts. Now, remember, space was very precious in antiquity, okay? You only had so much space on a scroll. You had to know where you were going before you started writing, okay? And so, again, this is a story that the Spirit of God puts upon the heart of each and every gospel writer to make sure it's included, okay? But it's not the first miracle story in any of the other gospels. It's only the first miracle story in the Gospel of Matthew. So again, it was highly, highly important, not only for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but especially for Matthew. Now let's talk about leprosy in Jewish society. Leprosy today, most of us are aware to some degree about what leprosy is. But no disease was more dreaded in the ancient world than leprosy. Okay, leprosy was the most feared and dreaded disease in the ancient world. Now, when we talk about leprosy, if you've read the book of Leviticus before, who's read Leviticus before? Sometimes it can feel like it bogs a little bit, and you say, well, why is all that there? It's really there on purpose. But you'll find over and over these references in the book of Leviticus to this terrible disease of leprosy. And what you'll find is leprosy was a generic word. It could refer to anything from a bad skin rash to the full-blown leprosy that you and I are probably thinking about right now, where unfortunately you go numb and you lose digits from your fingers or toes. It's a horrible, horrible disease. And this is the disease that this man is full of. Now, again, not only was leprosy bad from a physical standpoint, but from a social standpoint, it was dreaded, especially in Jewish society. Do you know why? Well, if you read in the book of Leviticus, you find that lepers weren't allowed to associate with anyone else that didn't have leprosy. They were forced to live outside of the community, outside the city in leper colonies. How many of you have seen the movie Ben-Hur before? It's a great movie, isn't it? You remember the story, they get healed at the end, but you remember they had to go and they had to live. It's a fictional story, but you know, it gives you the picture. They had to live outside of the community. They couldn't sit next to their brother or sister in church. They couldn't hang out with their friends, so to speak. They were, again, forced to flee from the rest of society. If you came into contact, you probably know the story. If you came anywhere near someone, you had to cover your face and you had to cry out, "Unclean, unclean." Now again, if you look at ancient Jewish sources, okay, obviously not as early as our New Testament text, but within several hundred years after, we find Jewish sources really talk about the fact that those who contracted this disease were considered as good as dead. Okay? Again, there was no cure. Again, we're just trying to take a few minutes tonight to really set the stage, because today, oftentimes, if leprosy's caught, you know there is a cure, but in antiquity there was no cure. So if you got leprosy, it was very, very dreaded. No cure. So again, it was as good as you were dead. Now remember, they're ceremonially unclean, they're contagious, so they had to keep themselves separate from all of society, and as we said earlier, according to Leviticus, they had to cry out, "Unclean, unclean." Now let's not forget, the leper didn't have, again, we would say today, couldn't come to church. Well, the leper in ancient society couldn't participate in corporate worship there in the Jewish temple, could they? No, they couldn't come in to the temple. They didn't know what it was like to experience the presence of God in a corporate atmosphere. How many of you are glad to be able to come to church with other brothers and sisters and to sing and to worship and to hear the word and to pray together in services? I mean, there's nothing like that, is there? No, there's not. God has called us to be a community. So imagine just for a few minutes to not be able to have any contact with the rest of humanity. What a terrible condition this man's in. And so we find what happens. Look in verse number 2. This guy is daring, isn't he? He does what most likely he knows he should have never done. He's literally laying his life on the line, because they could have easily stoned him, but he probably figures he doesn't have anything to lose, right? There's no cure for this leprosy. So he ventures out among the crowd, again, in disobedience really to Leviticus 13:46, if you want to write it down. Because here's what it says: "He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp." And you remember later on in Luke, we'll find a group of 10 lepers that they do keep their distance, don't they? And they cry out to Jesus from a distance, "Jesus, have mercy on us. Heal us." You remember the story. He says, "Go and be clean." And as they're going, as they're on their way, remember what happens? They're cleansed, but it's only one, and he's a Samaritan that comes back and gives glory to God. It's a clear statement that Jesus and his followers have got to reach out to those that the world has forsaken. We've got to reach out and touch and give hope to those who feel like they're in a hopeless situation.